We are continuing with Brain Anatomy of Duality. We will look at all the brain states, brain functioning, different areas of the brain, as has been researched through Dr. Daniel Amen, who I just gave you an overview about, and whose persistence and research in helping to reemerge SPECT Imaging has made fantastic advancements in medicine. So we're going to be looking at functions of these separate brain areas and then looking at the barking dog thought-related problem areas. And then later on in this whole program, under interventions and prescriptions and meditation, we'll have what the recommendations Dr. Amen offers for handling abnormalities in these areas of the brain. And this is really exciting stuff. And it builds very well upon some of the things that Joseph Chilton Pierce shared in his book, The Biology of Transcendence. So again, this book is Change Your Brain, Change Your Life, the breakthrough program for conquering anxiety, depression, obsessiveness, anger, violence, and impulsiveness. Okay, so we're going to look first at the Deep Limbic System and how love and depression are related to it, or love and affective disorders are related to it. The basic functions of the Deep Limbic System, and this is just an overview, we're not going to go into in-depth quotes over and over, but basically, the limbic system, including what is known as the thalamic structures and the hypothalamus, which are in all surrounding areas. We're not looking at the whole limbic system as a whole because that's sometimes differentiated from the deep limbic system, which we're looking at. The limbic system as a whole in brain science or neurology or in neuro-psychiatry is also incorporates what's known as the cingulate gyrus and the deep temporal lobes, which I think we're going to be handling as a subject in itself. Now, what does the deep limbic system do? It sets the emotional tone of the mind. It filters external events through internal states, such as what's known as emotional coloring. It's what gives flavor and zest to information that we process in the internal states. It's how we know them. We know them according to these qualities of coloring, emotional coloring. The deep limbic system tags events as internally important. It stores highly charged emotional memories. It modulates motivation, controls appetite, and sleep cycles. It promotes bonding. That's a very big one. And we see bonding happening with mammals, with dogs and wolf packs. We see that especially with dogs with their young, and other animals as well, but even domesticated animals. But dogs especially, when the deep limbic system is functioning effectively. Here you process sense and smell, and it also modulates libido, or sexual interest, sexual drive, the drive for procreation. But the limbic system lies near the center of the brain, and its size is that of a walnut, says Dr. Amen. It's power-packed with these functions which I've listed, which are critical for human behavior and survival. From an evolutionary standpoint, this is an older part of the mammalian brain that enabled animals to experience and express emotions. And what happened, now that we have the basis of the fivefold brain system already revealed in this program, it freed them from the stereotypical behavior and actions dictated by the brain stem found in the older reptilian brain. Now, the subsequent evolution, Amen says, of the surrounding cerebral cortex in higher animals, especially humans, gave us the capacity for problem solving, planning, organization, and rational thought. Yet, in order for these functions to have an effect in the world, one must have passion, emotion, and the desire to make something happen. The deep limbic system adds the emotional spice, if you will, that's the coloring, in both positive and negative ways. So this part of the brain, as I mentioned, is involved in setting the emotional tone. When the deep limbic system is less active, there is generally a positive, more hopeful state of mind. When it is heated up or overactive, negativity can take over. And Dr. Amen notes that this finding actually surprised his colleagues at the clinic that he worked at, and it surprised him as well. We thought, he said, that excessive activity in the part of the brain that controlled emotion might correlate with enhanced feelings of all kinds, not solely negative ones. But through what's known as SPECT imaging, they noticed again and again that when this area was overactive, it correlated with the subject's depression and negativity. Both the dogs of depression, dogs of negativity, those negative states translated into thought and translated into the reality, or, well, the reality that is experienced, even though it's not reality, but the world in which we see. Mental illness or brain abnormalities in any regard or any sense, limbic system or other systems, affect our thoughts, they affect our body, the bodies that we make, they affect the world we see, and the world we experience through our perceptions or misperceptions more so. It seems, Dr. Amen says, that when the deep limbic system is inflamed, painful emotional shading results. Now, what's important about the deep limbic system? The emotional shading provided by the deep limbic system is the filter through which you interpret the events of the day. As I said, it colors the events depending upon your emotional state of mind. When you're sad, with an overactive deep limbic system, you're likely to interpret neutral events through a negative filter. So the misperception. Of Course in Miracles and Way of Mastery say we should remain neutral about all things, so as not to suffer, so as not to misperceive, so as not to miscreate, so as not to react, so as not to fall into judgment. All forms of suffering that are thought-based, and impulse-based, and brain-based, as I'm trying to point out. That the brain itself needs to be in entrainment with the heart. It needs to be at optimal functioning in order for our thought life to be healthy. So, and we also, as I mentioned in the brief summary a few moments ago, that emotional tagging events is critical to survival. This relates in the evolutionary perspective in mating, which drives us to action, whether to mate with a desired mate or not to, rather through avoidance behavior or withdrawing from someone who has hurt us in the past. He goes on to talk about how PMS in women actually is not just merely a hormonal phenomenon, but the drop in hormones activates and colors the deep limbic system in a negative way. So that can affect love and affection in a negative way, and therefore our ability to love versus live in fear or all the resulting negative states that come from fear. Now, very important, the deep limbic system, along with the deep temporal lobes, which we'll get into later on, has also been reported to be involved in storing highly charged emotional memories. That's what Eckhart Tolle would call those elements of which would comprise what Eckhart Tolle calls the pain body, which we'll be learning more about. So it stores highly charged emotional memories, both positive and negative. So if you've been in dramatic situations, for example, in a car accident, or watching your house burn down, or been abused by a parent or spouse, these emotional components of the memory are stored in the deep limbic system of the brain. And this affects your ability to be in the present, your ability to think with the Holy Spirit, or to think with the God self. It impacts and impairs the ability to think first with the God self. A great deal of healing is needed to get into that God mind state. That's why the brain is so imperative to our overall holistic health and how we experience the world that we see. Two more positive charged emotions might be graduating magna cum laude or watching your child's birth. They're stored here as well. So it's not all just negative. But the deep limbic system also affects motivation and drive, overactivity in this area. In our experience, says Dr. Amen, is associated with lower motivation and drive, which is often seen in depression. Sleep and appetite, as mentioned before, bonding and social connectedness is affected by the deep limbic structures. And when they're damaged, it's been shown that mothers in animals that have been tested in labs, they will not feed or nurture their young. Actually, a study of rats showed that a mother who had deep limbic damage dragged these baby rats around the cage and treated them as if they were inanimate objects. There was no affection or no bonding taking place, as well as no care for the young. So the deep limbic system affects the bonding mechanism that enables you to socially connect with other people. And I believe I had some overactivity in this area. I was always trying to figure out what was wrong. Really what I was starving for was affection. And then when I was in all these relationships with females that I befriended and then ended up dating, and then seemingly ended up getting betrayed by or hurt by, I was overly sensitive, and this impacted me deep at a deep level. I'm not saying this for pity, but I'm saying this because I understand, and this is very true. And so, even to this day, I avoid, intimacy is an issue, which we'll talk about more later in another section. But, the bonding mechanism, I feel this deep hole, and I've been blessed with loving people in my life who are also on the spiritual journey that are helping me to heal this void. I'm not using them. Although there is a tendency for people who do have lack of bonding to have reactive attachment disorders, which isn't what we're going to be focusing on. But, this push-pull. You want to be close to someone, but then you're too afraid that they're going to reject you, so you pull back. Or when they do reject you, you pull back. So not only social connectedness and bonding, but the tone and quality of moods and smell in the olfactory system can create deep emotional connectedness or lack thereof. Such as somebody wearing cologne or perfume that can activate the deep limbic system in a certain way. And Overactivity in the deep limbic system is often associated with which is, as I said earlier, is often associated with depression. It frequently results in decreased libido or sexual interest. And this, I've had to say, and I've learned that many people become celibate, whether priests, monks, nuns from different faith systems, for the wrong reasons. They think they're doing something for God, but it's just that they're very uncomfortable or they don't have any sex drive. And actually, most monastics will tell you, or many celibates will tell you, that their sexuality, their sexual energy, needs to be incorporated in, especially so in systems like tantric yoga or yoga meditation, the yoga lifestyle, the yoga psychology, the yoga philosophy as a whole needs to be engaged. The need for it needs to be transcended, but you can't deny that it exists. And that's why I think that many of these instances of pedophilia have arisen and come to the surface in the last decade or so, not just in the Roman Catholic Church, but in many other areas where there are people who have a repressed desire for sex that comes out in abnormal, dysfunctional ways. I just thought it was important to point out, interesting to point out, that the female limbic system is actually bigger than in males. Now, I mentioned the hypothalamus. It is at the base of the brain, and it is responsible for translating our emotional state into physical feelings of relaxation or tension. These are Dr. Amen's words. The front half of the hypothalamus sends calming signals to the body through the parasympathetic nervous system. The back half of the hypothalamus sends stimulating or fear signals to the body through the sympathetic nervous system. So here is where the seemingly demonic or egoic function of fear enters into the equation of health, wellness, mental health, bodily health in our relationship with the human family, with God, with perceptions of God, as well as your relationship to the outside world or your lack of relationship to the outside world, and also to the world that you help to dream into reality or create. The back half of the hypothalamus, when stimulated, is responsible for the fight or flight response. So that'll tell you a little bit about, that tells us a little bit about fear that might be ignited, or this aggression, fight for your life response in reactive or aggressive dog-like behavior, dog-like thinking. And in essence, there's not a lot of thinking that takes place. There's not a lot of processing that takes place, but these barking dogs, these violent dogs, or these highly reactive dogs are metaphorically affected by the deep limbic system malfunction. Okay, no, what are some problems in the deep limbic system? Well, as mentioned in Gerald May's work, we talked about moods and affect. Well, moodiness is a problem. Irritability is a problem. Clinical depression is another. Clinical depression, dog disorders, these moody dogs, these irritability dogs. There's increased negative thinking dogs, decreased motivation dogs, flood of negative emotion dogs, appetite and sleep problem dogs, decreased or increased sexual response, says dogs, as well as social isolation. And in this chapter that I'm looking into love and depression. Depression is one of the affective disorders that he mentions, as did Gerald May previously in what we heard, what I shared with you. And manic depression or bipolar is another area. And he talked about what helps to trigger that, sometimes from an external standpoint, but also from the brain abnormality standpoint, which all of his research is based off of the SPECT imaging. And later, we will be giving prescriptions for deep limbic system problem patterns. And Dr. Amen has done a wonderful job of researching and implementing things that have helped countless number of people. Now, we're going to look into anxiety and fear and how it's related to the basal ganglia. Basically, the basal ganglia are a set of large structures toward the center of the brain that surround the deep limbic system. The basal ganglia are involved with integrating feelings, thoughts, and movement. The key one for our sake being thoughts and feelings. Those barking dogs that help to shape our world, internally and externally. So the functions are integrating feeling and movement, as well as thoughts. The function of integrating feelings, thoughts, and movement is why people jump when they're excited, tremble when they're nervous, or freeze when they're scared, or even get tongue-tied when, say, a supervisor or a boss is, quote-unquote, chewing you out. The basal ganglia allows for a smooth integration of emotions, thoughts, and physical movement, and when there is too much input, they tend to lock up. Some people call this brain lock. Other functions, it helps to suppress unwanted motor behaviors. It sets the body's idle speed or anxiety level. It enhances motivation. And it mediates pleasure and ecstasy. And when the basal ganglia are overreactive, or overactive rather, as we've seen in the case of people with anxiety tendencies or disorders, so Amen says, people are more likely to be overwhelmed by stressful situations and have a tendency to freeze or become immobile in thoughts and in actions. So this is the mute dog, but the dog that you want to be able to be functioning correctly. It's not the muzzled dog in the sense that where we're protected from a violent outburst from a dog or from the noise of a dog that won't stop barking. But this is a dog who's mute, who we want to be functioning in a healthy fashion. When the basal ganglia are underactive, as we've seen in people who have attention deficit disorder or ADD, often a stressful situation moves them to action. So there's the opposite. And he said about himself that the activity in his basal ganglia makes it harder to move quickly in anxiety-provoking situations. So there's an overall crippling. Anxiety can be crippling, as we've learned both from Gerald May and Dr. Amen. And that affects our relationships with others and the world we create. So brain states, again, I'll say it again, and I'll keep saying it. The brain states. We can't pretend the brain is not real, because it is. And we can't just ignore the brain and body and everything that happens in it just because it isn't who we truly are. Because when we're in relativity or subjectivity, then we are experiencing the effects of mind and body. We don't just pretend the body doesn't exist, like it's just thin air or gas or a nebulous force or a nebulous mass. Well, that mass would imply matter, a nebulous form, kind of like vapor. Many people with ADD were affected by underactive activity in the basal ganglia. They complain that they have trouble getting their thoughts out of their head and onto paper. And Amen terms this finger agnosia. It's when the fingers can't tell what the brain is thinking. I can relate to this. Not again for pity, but because I do have attentional challenges. But you know what? I did well all through school. And it wasn't until I had many things to try to juggle that I really became apparent that just a little bit of help in this area, in the medical sense, would make a big difference. And it has. Now I'm able to complete projects. Now I'm able to stick to a schedule more often than not. And you know what? It's just overall more organized thinking. And I think that's really important, because a chaotic thought life turns into a chaotic life in the world. Very, very much so. So, overactive basal ganglia are often associated with anxiety, tension, and increased awareness. These are all forms of barking dogs, as well as with heightened fear. Dogs of fear that we hear, that we are led by due to abnormal or overactive brain functions. Underactive basal ganglia can cause problems with motivation, energy, and basic get up and go. Eamon talks about having scanned using SPECT imaging many CEOs who have significant increased activity in this part of the brain. And him and his colleagues theorized that some people can use this increased activity in the form of motivation to become movers, to be on the go. So even though they might tend to get a bit anxious, they do get things done. The basal ganglia are also likely involved in the pleasure control loops of the brain. So that could explain a lot about sense desires. And what they found, when Eamon and his colleagues found, that when they looked at what was actually during a brain imaging study performed by Nora Volkow's group at the Brookhaven National Laboratory in Upton, New York, they found that they found how cocaine and Ritalin work in the brain, and both were taken up mostly by the basal ganglia. And obviously cocaine is an addictive substance, and even though Ritalin can become an addictive substance, and therefore that's why it's a controlled substance, it's in doses it's prescribed for ADD and tends not to be as addictive. But the study that Eamon's talking about clearly showed why. He said cocaine is a powerful enhancer of dopamine availability in the brain, and it has both very fast uptake and clearance from the brain. So you get this strong, powerful wave coming on, then it's gone, and then the user gets a high, and when it's gone, he or she wants more. That forms the addiction. Ritalin, in the positive sense, and I'm advocating for pharmacological intervention, in this whole concept of trying to create a better thought life, Ritalin enhances motivation, focus, and follow through, but does not give users a high or an intense desire to use more unless it's used at much higher doses than clinically prescribed. Now, also, intense romantic love can also have a cocaine-like effect. It's funny because in one of my poems, I believe it was one of my poems or songs, I can't remember exactly which one, I had used this analogy, having never, ever, I don't even know what cocaine, if it has a smell or anything. I've never used it, or I've seen it, on TV and all that, but this, it's very interesting that he says this cocaine-like effect on the brain, robustly releasing dopamine in the basal ganglia. Love, which I think he's talking about infatuation rather, has real effects. And he said he had the opportunity to scan a close friend of his shortly after he had met a woman who he fell head over heels for. And he had his brain scanned, met the girl, went out, after about their third date, did another scan. Did a scan to see what this new love would do, what it did to the brain. And to Eamon's amazement, his brain looked as if he had just taken a lot of cocaine. That the activity in both the right and left basal ganglia was very intense, almost to the point of resembling seizure activity. So the love, the kind of love that most people, including myself, refer to has real effects on the brain, as powerful as addictive drugs. Some people have equated falling in love with the reward center that is activated from eating chocolate. Eamon doesn't comment on that, but this addictive nature, I see, if from a divine perspective, a divine mind perspective, a divine intelligence perspective, this magnetic appeal. Love, or infatuation as it usually starts out, brings people together to ultimately to court, to get to know, to enjoy one's presence, and then maybe to be in union or marry with. This could be part of God's plan. But again, most people don't have this knowledge that they could be falling into an addiction, and then what ends up happening, and I can relate to this as well, because I've been down the road of destructive relationships where the person for me became a drug. Every aspect of the relationship with this female, young woman, became like a drug, and when she broke off the relationship, and when I'd found out she'd been unfaithful, I went through withdrawal. Not just a broken heart, but went through withdrawal. So, hence, my intervening advice, if you don't have the balance of unconditional love and rationality in a relationship, a new formed relationship, it's going to be built upon these addictive feelings. And relationships ultimately are part of what we and how we interact in the world. And if you're looking at the world from an addictive, love-like, infatuation-like mindset, then you're going to see God, or the God mind, the unified field, the allness, the divinity of all that is, as well as every other person through that addictive love program. And how do you think the world will look then? Okay, really quickly, problems with the basal ganglia. Anxiety, nervousness, panic attacks, physical sensations of anxiety, a tendency to predict the worst, conflict avoidance, Tourette syndrome or tics, muscle tension, soreness, tremors, fine motor problems, headaches, low excessive motivation. So the basal ganglia activity resets what's known as the body's idle to a revved up level and can make people feel anxious, nervous, tense, and pessimistic. Amen said that almost all the patients he has treated with panic disorder, whom he has scanned, had heightened basal ganglia activity. Certain disorders that fall under this category, I said panic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. I mentioned conflict avoidance. And he says that anxiety is by definition very uncomfortable. And so thus, people who are anxious tend to avoid any situations that make them more uncomfortable, especially dealing with conflict. And people who have basal ganglia problems tend to be frozen by conflict and consequently do what they can to avoid it. Another experience of being frozen or locked. And if you go to the shutdown phase, and if you're caught in these loops of anxiety and panic, then the world is hell, and you have descended into hell. The hell that comes from the mind, or the brain, rather. Then he mentions Tourette's, as I already mentioned, and fine motor problems, low and high motivation. Now, I want to go through this basal ganglia checklist. I think this is important. Now, this isn't for self-diagnostic purposes, but this might prompt you to get in touch with a professional on this issue. Now, rate yourself on each behavior that I list. And use this scale and place the appropriate number next to the item. And if we end up with more symptoms marked 3 or 4, that indicates a high likelihood of basal ganglia problems. This is just a simple tool, and we'll use it. So 0 is never, 1 is rarely, 2 is occasionally, 3 frequently, 4 very frequently. Okay. First number on the checklist. Feelings of nervousness or anxiety. 0 through 4. Put down your answer. Panic attacks. Symptoms of heightened muscle tension, headaches, sore muscles, hand tremor. Periods of heart pounding, rapid heart rate, or chest pain. Periods of trouble breathing or feeling smothered. Periods of feeling dizzy, faint, or unsteady on your feet. Periods of nausea or abdominal upset. Periods of sweating, hot or cold flashes, cold hands. tendency to predict the worst. Fear of dying or doing something crazy. Avoidance of public places for fear of having an anxiety attack. Conflict avoidance. Excessive fear of being judged or scrutinized by others. Persistent phobias. Low motivation. Excessive motivation. Tics. Quick startle reaction. Tendency to freeze in anxiety-provoking situations. Excessive worry about what others think. Low threshold of embarrassment. Okay. Now, quickly just look over what you've written, numbers you've written down. If you have a lot of 3 or 4s, this indicates a high likelihood of basal ganglia problems, most likely fear, panic, or anxiety-related problems. And the first thing you should do is, if you haven't already, get in contact with your primary care physician and see if he or she will refer you to a mental health professional, such as a therapist who can diagnose or a psychiatrist who can do the same as well as prescribe medication. Again, this book and anything in this program that I have shared is not to be used at the expense of professional medical advice and treatment. On the next CD, the next part of this discourse, we'll look into inattention and impulsivity. Those darn dogs, those sense-desire dogs that want to rule our entire field of awareness and keep us constantly grasping, self-grasping outward